Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Three best friends, Mark, Julia, and Tom, set off for a weekend camping trip deep in the remote Black Ridge Forest. The isolation was part of the appeal. No distractions, no responsibilities, just nature and the open sky. The plan was simple: hike through the wilderness, camp under the stars, and leave their worries behind. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting an orange glow over the dense trees. A cold wind whispered through the forest, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth. The trio found the perfect spot for their camp, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. Mark pitched his tent first, a large green structure that could fit all three of them comfortably. Julia and Tom followed, setting up their smaller tents side by side, the campfire crackling between them. They smiled and laughed, feeling the weight of their daily lives slip away with each passing moment. As night fell, the temperature dropped. The fire roared in the center of their campsite, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. The trio sat around it, eating marshmallows, telling stories, and enjoying each other's company. The forest around them seemed to close in as the night deepened, but the warmth of the fire kept the cold at bay. But something was off. Julia noticed it first, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, like they were moving of their own accord. She brushed it off as a trick of the firelight, but unease settled in her chest. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, were absent. It was unnervingly quiet. "It's too quiet," she murmured, glancing around. Mark, ever the skeptic, chuckled. "You're just imagining things. It's the forest. It's supposed to be quiet at night." Julia wasn't so sure, but she stayed silent. Tom tried to lighten the mood by telling a spooky story, but even his voice seemed to falter in the stillness of the night. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and the three friends decided to call it a night. They retreated to their tents, each one zipping up tight against the cool night air. The fire died down to embers, leaving the campsite in near darkness. Hours passed. Julia woke with a start. Something wasn't right. A low, rhythmic scraping sound filled the air, soft but distinct, like something being dragged across the ground. It started faintly, but grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. Julia sat up, heart pounding, and shook Tom awake. "Tom, do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Tom rubbed his eyes, groggy, and listened. The sound continued, like something dragging itself through the leaves. He got up slowly, careful not to wake Mark, and unzipped the tent. Outside, the forest was eerily silent, save for the scraping noise that seemed to be circling the campsite. The shadows of the trees stretched unnaturally long, twisted shapes that swayed even though there was no wind. Tom grabbed the flashlight from his bag and stepped outside. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, more to reassure himself than Julia. But something about the sound felt wrong. It didn't have the randomness of an animal. It was methodical, deliberate, like whatever was out there was watching them. Tom flashed the light around the campsite, but saw nothing. The fire had burned down to nothing but glowing embers. He returned to the tent, his mind racing with possibilities, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He zipped up the tent, but neither of them could get back to sleep. The night seemed endless. When morning finally came, they were all exhausted and on edge. Julia and Tom crawled out of their tent to find Mark's tent gone. Gone. At first, they thought it was a joke, Mark playing some prank on them. But as they looked around, the area where Mark's tent had been was completely undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no sign that the tent had ever been there. The ground was bare, save for a few twigs scattered around. The fire pit from the night before still stood, but everything else was untouched. "Mark," Julia called out, her voice trembling. "Mark, where are you?" There was no answer. Tom's heart began to race. He rushed to the spot where the tent had been, searching for anything, his phone, his backpack, anything. But nothing. Mark's stuff was gone. His wallet, his keys, everything. Even his sleeping bag was missing. Where could he have gone? Julia whispered, fear rising in her chest. He wouldn't just leave. Not without his stuff. We need to find him, Tom said, trying to remain calm. He's probably just messing with us. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. They searched the surrounding area, calling Mark's name, but there was no sign of him. No traces. No footprints in the dirt. Nothing. Julia was growing frantic. This isn't right. We need to go back to the car and call for help. Tom reluctantly agreed. But as they turned to leave, they found that the trail back to the parking lot wasn't as clear as it had been before. The path they had followed the day before seemed different, as if it had shifted, or worse, as if it was never there to begin with. The trees around them seemed to close in, the woods becoming more oppressive, suffocating. They couldn't find their way back. And then, just as they were about to give up, they stumbled upon a familiar clearing. A clearing that looked eerily like their campsite. But Mark's tent was back. It stood there, as if it had never disappeared, perfectly pitched, as though nothing had happened. The fire pit was still there, though the firewood they had left behind was gone. "Mark?" Julia called out, her voice shaking. There was no response. They both approached the tent cautiously, their steps hesitant. Tom unzipped the door and peered inside. It was empty. The tent was exactly as it had been the night before, but there was no sign of Mark. His things, his wallet, his phone, were all missing, but his sleeping bag was placed neatly in the corner. Then, Julia's gaze landed on something chilling, the phone. Mark's phone. It lay in the middle of the tent, its screen cracked and its battery dead. Tom picked it up, the cold plastic sending a shiver down his spine. Something about it felt off. Too cold, too unnatural. As he held the phone, the same low, guttural sound from the night before filled the air. It came from deep within the forest, but this time, it was accompanied by a faint whispering, as if the trees themselves were speaking. The shadows in the trees seemed to move, undulating, shifting. Something was watching them, something malevolent and ancient. Without another word, Julia and Tom turned and ran. Their feet pounded the forest floor, their breath ragged, hearts pounding in their chests. The woods seemed to twist around them, branches clawing at their clothes, roots tripping them as if the forest itself was trying to stop them. The path back to the car was no longer a simple trail. It was a maze, and they were trapped. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled out of the woods and into the open space of the parking lot. Their car was exactly where they'd left it, parked under the bright afternoon sun. Without a second thought, they jumped inside, slammed the doors shut, and sped away. They never spoke about that night again, but both of them knew deep down that whatever had happened in Black Ridge Forest was not over. Mark was gone, and they were certain the forest was still watching them, waiting. Days later, the authorities conducted a search, but they found no trace of Mark. No footprints, no evidence, no tent, nothing. The forest had taken something that night, and it was still waiting for the next lost souls to wander too far off the beaten path. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Sarah, Ben, and their friend Alice had been planning this camping trip for weeks. They chose a secluded spot near the edge of Black Hollow Creek, far away from the crowded campsites that dotted the rest of the forest. It was the perfect escape, just the three of them, the crackling campfire, and the quiet of the wilderness. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple. The air was crisp, with a slight chill that hinted at the coolness of the night to come. They set up camp, each of them taking a moment to enjoy the serenity that surrounded them. The forest was dense here, the trees towering above them like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets to the wind. As darkness fell, they sat around the campfire, the flames dancing in the cool night air. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the forest floor. They roasted marshmallows, shared stories, and laughed, the sound of their voices echoing into the stillness of the woods. But as the night wore on, a strange unease settled over Sarah. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something, or someone, was watching them from the darkness beyond the firelight. She glanced around, trying to push the thought from her mind. It was probably just the isolation, the natural paranoia that came with being out in the wilderness at night. Then, out of nowhere, she heard a sound, footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, coming from the trees on the other side of the campfire. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The others hadn't heard it yet, too busy with their conversation, but she was sure of what she'd heard. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben turned his head, squinting into the darkness. "What?" "Footsteps," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "Someone's out there." Ben and Alice looked at each other, confused. "It's probably just an animal," Alice said with a nervous laugh, trying to dismiss Sarah's fear. "Or maybe someone else camping nearby." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The footsteps were too deliberate, too slow, and they weren't coming from the direction of the nearby campgrounds. "Maybe we should go check," Ben suggested, his curiosity piqued. Reluctantly, the three of them stood up, grabbing flashlights from their packs. The fire crackled behind them, casting flickering light as they walked cautiously into the woods. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. The usual sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No rustling leaves, no crickets chirping, just the sound of their own breathing and the crunch of their boots on the dry forest floor. As they ventured deeper into the trees, the hairs on Sarah's neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led deeper into the woods, as if the forest itself was guiding them towards something. Her heart raced, but she kept walking, determined to figure out what was going on. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. The moonlight illuminated the space, revealing an old, weathered log cabin standing in the middle of the clearing. It seemed abandoned, its windows dark and empty. The air felt colder here, the temperature dropping sharply, as if the forest itself was pushing back against their presence. "Who would build a cabin all the way out here?" Ben asked, his voice laced with unease. Sarah's gaze moved to the edge of the clearing, where she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the trees. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. "Is that?" Alice started, but her voice trailed off. Before Sarah could respond, the figure stepped forward, revealing a man dressed in old, tattered clothing. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his eyes gleamed unnaturally bright in the moonlight. He didn't speak. He simply stared at them with an unsettling, knowing gaze. "Can I help you?" Ben called out, his voice unsteady. The man took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "You shouldn't be here," the man finally spoke, his voice raspy, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "The forest doesn't like visitors. It doesn't like outsiders." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a twisted smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something sinister. His eyes never left theirs as he took another step forward. "I've seen people like you before," he said, his voice barely audible. "You come to take what doesn't belong to you. But the forest doesn't forget." Before they could respond, the man turned and began to walk slowly into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah, Ben, and Alice stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. A cold chill washed over them, making the firelight seem warm in comparison. "We need to get back to the campsite," Ben said, his voice urgent. "Now." The three of them turned and made their way back to the camp, but the forest seemed different now. The trees towered above them like dark sentinels, and the path seemed longer, as though the woods were closing in around them. Every step felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer with each passing moment. When they finally returned to the campsite, they found everything exactly as they had left it. The fire still burned brightly, casting its warm light into the night. But something was wrong. The air felt thicker, colder, and Sarah felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Just as they were about to sit down, they heard something behind them, a low, raspy voice whispering in the wind. "You shouldn't be here," it said, just as the man had. They whirled around, but there was no one there. The campsite was empty, save for the three of them. The fire crackled and popped, but the shadows around them seemed darker now. The strange, oppressive feeling only grew stronger, as if the very forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They stayed up all night, the unease gnawing at them as they huddled around the fire. No one slept. Every noise, every rustling of the trees made their hearts race. The stranger's words echoed in their minds, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them. The next morning, they packed up quickly, barely speaking as they broke down camp. As they drove away from the forest, Sarah glanced back at the trees through the rearview mirror, her stomach tight with fear. But the worst part? When they reached the edge of the forest and passed the last line of trees, Sarah swore she saw the man standing there, watching them drive away, his eyes gleaming in the distance. And as the car sped away, she knew that the forest had not let them go. It had only been waiting for the right moment, the moment they would return. It was meant to be a typical hiking trip, just a few friends, a scenic trail, and the promise of an adventurous weekend surrounded by the natural beauty of the mountains. Amelia, Lucas, and Ethan were excited. The trail they had chosen was a popular one, known for its breathtaking views and challenging paths. They'd been talking about this trip for weeks, eager to escape the city's chaos and immerse themselves in the peace and quiet of the woods. The sun was high in the sky as they started their hike, the cool mountain air filling their lungs. Birds chirped in the trees, and the rustling of leaves beneath their boots was the only sound that accompanied them as they walked. They were deep into the forest, the trees growing taller and denser as they made their way up the mountain. The path twisted and turned, but it was clear, well marked with signs and trail markers. Amelia, who was always the most adventurous of the group, led the way, her camera in hand as she snapped pictures of the landscape. Lucas, ever the nature enthusiast, was already talking about the animals they might encounter, while Ethan, who preferred the quiet and stillness of the outdoors, kept to himself, enjoying the serenity of the hike. They were miles into the trail when something strange happened. They reached a fork in the path. One direction led uphill toward a clearing that promised a great view, while the other wound deeper into the forest, curving away from the main route. This way, Amelia said, pointing toward the more secluded path. Let's take this one. It looks like it'll lead us to something amazing. Lucas and Ethan exchanged unsure glances but nodded. They trusted Amelia's instincts. They followed her down the trail, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The path grew narrower, and the trees began to press in around them, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air grew heavier, the quiet almost unnerving. The only sound was the soft crunch of their boots on the earth. After about an hour of walking, the trail started to change. The clear path they had been following seemed to grow less defined. The markers on the trees became sporadic, and the trail itself became harder to see. It was almost as if the forest was swallowing them up, pushing them further into its depths. "We've been walking for a while," Lucas said, his voice tinged with concern. "Shouldn't we turn back soon?" Ethan nodded, his unease palpable. "Yeah, this doesn't feel right. The trail's getting harder to follow." Amelia, however, was determined. She pushed forward, confident they were heading in the right direction. "It's fine," she said. "We're close to something. I can feel it." But despite her confidence, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching longer as they moved deeper. The further they went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of wildlife, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed to vanish, replaced by an unsettling silence. Then, something happened that made them stop in their tracks. Ahead, the trail seemed to disappear. One moment, they were following a well-worn path, and the next, there was nothing, just dense undergrowth and thick trees, blocking any further progress. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, staring ahead, his heart racing. The trail just vanished. Amelia frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "That's impossible. We were just following it." But there it was, no trace of the path they had been following, as though the earth itself had swallowed it up. The trees around them seemed to close in tighter, the air growing colder. The unsettling silence deepened. "We need to go back," Lucas said, his voice now laced with fear. "This isn't right." Ethan agreed, his instincts telling him they had wandered too far. But when they turned to retrace their steps, something even more disturbing happened. The path they had walked on, the very trail they had been following moments ago, was gone. It was as though it had never existed. Panic set in. "Where's the trail?" Amelia shouted, her voice cracking. "It was just here." But the path had completely disappeared. The forest stretched around them in every direction, but there was no sign of the way they had come. The air grew thicker, heavier, and for a moment, the group was paralyzed by a cold, sinking feeling. The trees, which had seemed comforting before, now loomed over them like towering giants, their branches creaking and groaning in the wind. The oppressive silence suffocated them, leaving only the pounding of their hearts in their ears. "We have to stay calm," Lucas said, trying to steady his breath. "We'll find another way. We just need to stay together." But as they stood there, trying to orient themselves, the forest around them seemed to shift. The trees no longer appeared familiar. The way they had come no longer seemed to exist. It was as if the very landscape had rearranged itself, trapping them in a place that didn't follow the rules of nature. The group continued to wander, hoping to find the trail again, but every turn they took led them deeper into the labyrinth of trees. Time seemed to lose its meaning. They had no idea how long they had been walking, and their exhaustion began to set in. Then, just when they thought they might be completely lost, they stumbled upon something, a small, dilapidated cabin, hidden in the woods. It was old, its windows dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, as though inviting them in. Against their better judgment, they approached the cabin. There was no sign of life, no animals, no sounds of movement inside, but the place felt off. The air around it was thick with something darker, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. "This is bad," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave now." But as they turned to leave, they heard a noise. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone was approaching from behind them. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she spun around, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But there was nothing there, and yet, the sound of footsteps grew louder, coming closer, but no one appeared. The forest had become a twisted maze of shadows, and with each passing second, it felt more like they were being hunted by something unseen. Amelia, Lucas, and Ethan ran. They ran as fast as they could, but no matter which direction they went, they couldn't escape the creeping feeling that they were being followed. The forest around them seemed to stretch out endlessly, and the trail, the way they had come, was nowhere to be found. By the time they finally emerged from the woods, hours had passed, but it felt like days. The sun was low in the sky, and the shadows stretched long over the ground. They were shaken, exhausted, and terrified. As they made their way back to civilization, they vowed never to return to that place again. The memory of the vanishing trail, the mysterious cabin, and the unsettling silence would stay with them forever. But the worst part? When they spoke to the locals about the trail, they were told there was no such path. There was no Black Hollow trail in those woods. The trail they had followed, the one that had led them into the heart of the forest, didn't exist. And perhaps it never had.